August 2nd, 1990, news broke that the elite Iraqi Republican Guard had invaded neighbouring Kuwait, an army that, when fully mobilized, numbered over 1 million men, and was well equipped with massive amounts of Soviet armaments. For the American government, the defense of nearby Saudi Arabia was of utmost importance. The disruption of Kuwaiti oil had damaged the global economy enough, and if the same happened to the Saudis, the consequences could be much worse. Thus, the US military began to mobilize for the defense of the Saudi borders with Kuwait and Iraq. But one question was on everyone's minds: could the US complete its mission this time? As it would turn out, not only did they complete it, but their victory in the Gulf War would catapult the US military back to its former global supremacy not seen since World War II. But when American troops arrived in Saudi Arabia on August 6th, they were still largely untested, the few conflicts they had been involved in since Vietnam, such as Grenada and Panama, not being the most favourable, and the whole world was ready to watch their trial by fire. Operation Desert Shield was the code name for the American military build-up in and defense of Saudi Arabia, and unlike they had in Vietnam, the US did not underestimate their enemy. From the beginning, the Iraqi army was treated incredibly seriously, and in a little over 2 months, the US sent the powerful 18th Airborne Corps to the Persian Gulf, including over 120,000 troops, 700 tanks, 1,400 armoured fighting vehicles, and 600 artillery pieces in conjunction with the 32,000 troops and 400 tanks provided by American allies in the Middle East. Furthermore, hundreds of aircraft were operating out of Saudi airfields, along with the airfields of American allies in the region, such as Turkey and Qatar, as well as more aircraft operating from aircraft carriers. Speaking of naval vessels, the US Navy was put on active duty and began imposing an effective blockade on Iraq's coast in the Persian Gulf. It was clear to all that the United States had no intention of repeating the mistakes of Vietnam. By the time Operation Desert Shield was at full strength, had the Iraqis chosen to attack Saudi territory, they would have been met with waves of sustained airstrikes, been driven into heavy and precisely surveyed artillery fire, and encountered the accuracy and firepower of the M1A1 Abrams tank, all before they had the opportunity to engage in effective combat. This barrage of armaments on the Iraqi army would have continued for the entire 200-kilometer stretch they would have to attack through to reach any target in Saudi Arabia that had strategic significance. However, the Iraqis stayed away from the Saudi borders, and their leader, Saddam Hussein, was increasingly frustrating the international community in finding a diplomatic solution to what at the time was just a small Middle Eastern flashpoint, and in November 1990, the mission was changed, now to the liberation of Kuwait. Operation Desert Shield was about to become Operation Desert Storm. By this time, the Iraqi army had firmly entrenched themselves along the Saudi-Kuwait border, reinforced by tank and other mechanized divisions, and breaking through these defenses would be the most direct route for retaking Kuwait. But initially, the United States and her allies of Great Britain and France wanted to attack Iraq directly. Concerns about a large ground war from their Arab allies, however, would lead to a new offensive strategy to be launched at the Iraqis. The fighting would begin with a multi-phased air campaign smashing through Iraqi air defenses, securing aerial supremacy, suppressing Iraqi command and control, and isolating the Kuwaiti theatre of operations in order to establish favourable conditions for a ground assault, whilst weakening Iraqi defences safely. Once this was done, the ground assault would begin with a number of division-sized feints around Kuwait and into Iraq, to draw attention away from the main attack of the 7th Infantry Corps, consisting of 5 heavy divisions, 4 separate field artillery brigades, an armoured cavalry regiment, and a separate aviation brigade. In January of 1991, this campaign against the Iraqi-occupied Kuwait was ready, and codenamed Operation Desert Storm. Then, on January 17th, the campaign began, and it was finally time to see if this plan would work, and if the United States could redeem itself from its military failures during and since the Vietnam War. The operation commenced in the early hours of the 17th, first with the aerial campaign against Iraq. Massive airstrikes and missile bombardments into Iraqi territory secured air supremacy for the United States, and did enough damage to cripple Iraqi command and control, along with disrupting their logistics. Anti-aircraft and radar sites in Iraq and Kuwait were the key targets, and American aircraft successfully eliminated the threats to their air supremacy. However, against the entrenched equipment of the Iraqis, it was less effective, but this would change when the ground assault would begin, forcing the movement of this protected equipment. Another issue with the air campaign was the surprise use of missiles by the Iraqis, known as Scuds. These were relatively primitive missiles, and the Iraqis only fired 86, but they were still hitting targets in Saudi Arabia, and there was the potential of Iraq firing them at Israel, a move that threatened the careful alliances the US had made with several Arab nations. Thus, their use pushed some of the forces dedicated to laying the groundwork for the ground assault to be diverted to hunt down Iraqi missiles. But overall, the air campaign from January 17th to February 24th was a great success. Now it was time for the ground assault, commencing on February 24th, and with American aerial power proven, the ground forces of the United States were ready to prove themselves as well. The Desert Storm ground assault began with a number of feints and supporting attacks to distract and confuse the Iraqi forces. First was the 5th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, creating the impression amongst Iraqi forces that an amphibious assault was imminent, and news coverage of the brigade supposedly preparing for such an assault shook the Iraqis enough for them to set up 4 divisions along its coastal areas, diverting forces for an attack that would never come. Next, the 1st Cavalry Division began by feinting up the Wadi al-Batin River, drawing the attention of 5 Iraqi divisions, and after doing some significant damage to them, the 1st Cavalry Division backed out and moved west to assist the main ground assault. These 2 deceptions worked brilliantly, the Iraqis fully believing an amphibious assault on the coast and a push up the Wadi al-Batin were coming, and by the time the real invasion was happening, 20% of the Iraqi forces were out of the fight. The Iraqis would try to redeploy their forces once they realized their mistake, but by then it was too late. Simultaneously, 3 supporting attacks had begun, the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force pushing from the elbow of Kuwait into Kuwait City, alongside the other 2 supporting attacks of the Saudi and Gulf Coalition comprised Joint Forces Command East, and Egyptian, Syrian and Saudi comprised Joint Forces Command North. By February 27th, these 3 supporting attacks had made it to Kuwait City, liberating the city, capturing thousands of Iraqi soldiers, and destroying dozens of their armoured vehicles. Alongside this, the 18th Airborne Corps initiated its own mission to isolate the Kuwaiti theatre, to cut the Iraqis in Kuwait off from their supply lines in Iraq, preventing new units from reaching Kuwait, and combat units from retreating back into Iraq. A combined assault of ground troops and attack helicopters began attacking the Iraqi routes into Kuwait, intercepting ground movement of Iraqi forces and accomplishing their mission with minimal force. The United States forces and their coalition allies had been incredibly successful with these feints and supporting attacks, putting the Iraqi forces in disarray and crippling them severely. And while all of this is occurring, the main assault is also underway. The main assault would be carried out primarily by the combined British and American 7th Corps, consisting of nearly 150,000 troops and almost 50,000 vehicles, a force so massive it spanned a width of 24 kilometers. This assault would demonstrate the full firepower and tactical bravado of the renewed US military against the formidable Iraqi Republican Guard. Tightly synchronized teams of M1A1 Abrams tanks and M2 Bradley APCs penetrated through Iraqi minefields and other obstacles they'd erected, with the rest of the ground forces pushing through the cracks opened up by the armored divisions. The Abrams tanks and Bradleys continued to advance on the front line, destroying Iraqi armor, with infantry units disembarking along the way as needed to clear positions and collect prisoners. Howitzers from the rear continued to bombard Iraqi positions effectively, but the advance of the coalition forces was so fast that they rarely had a chance to fire. Furthermore, the American equipment of night vision sights allowed for the aggression to continue regardless of the hour, and all of the coalition forces combined surprised, outflanked, outranged, and in any given exchange outgunned the Iraqis. This decisive attack achieved decisive results, and within 100 hours of the ground assault's launch, Operation Desert Storm had successfully liberated Kuwait from Iraqi forces, with only 148 American soldiers losing their lives. Finally, after almost 2 decades, the United States military had redeemed itself. None of what happened in the Gulf War would have been possible without the significant changes made to the US military post-Vietnam. The introduction of new military technology, new training, better command structures, and the all-volunteer force all played a role in the success of Desert Shield and Desert Storm. The embarrassed force that left Vietnam was now once again arguably the most powerful military in the world, and had demonstrated to everyone that the United States is a force to be reckoned with. Instead of refusing to acknowledge their mistakes and repeating them, they grew from the lessons learnt from Vietnam. The mission was clear, the force carrying it out was ready and willing, the weapons they used were superior and effective, and the command structure was more streamlined. And now, they were victorious. The United States had pulled off the greatest modern military comeback, and over the course of the next 20 years would continue its successes, having many more successful operations and facing little in the way of defeats. But for now, the war was won, and all of America could be proud of the job done by their armed forces.